Good afternoon, everyone. Our topic, as I mentioned earlier, is the life and times of Margaret Fell. And I think it's serendipity that it would have fallen on this Sunday because, as John mentioned in his Joys and Concerns, it's World Quaker Day. And I think of this as sort of a virtual family reunion. There are 400,000 of us in 87 different countries, so we're far-flung, and we're few, really, relatively speaking. So it's important to have a day like this where we try very intentionally to reconnect with each other. And this is the description that was shared by the Friends World Committee on Consultation. As the sun rises in each area of the world, we want to remember that Quakers are worshiping through every time zone, celebrating our deep connections across cultures and Quaker traditions. We are united in love and can accompany each other on this special day that draws us together. As we worship, let us hold each other in prayer and thanksgiving, and let our hymns of praise resound across the world. So it seems an especially good occasion to deepen our knowledge and understanding of the origins of Quakerism and the founders of our faith, and to learn more about how their thoughts, their beliefs, and their practices have come down to us through these almost 400 years. And today we're doing that through the life of Margaret Fell. Next slide. So who is Margaret Fell? Who was Margaret Fell? She was a very complex and multifaceted woman. She's often described as the mother of Quakerism. We can see her complexity when we consider her many roles, and some of them are listed here. They include, among others, a wife and partner, a loving mother, a gracious host, a gentlewoman, a feminist, a writer, an advocate, a correspondent, an organizer, and a seeker. And I'm sure there are others we could add. Recent academic studies suggest that her role and contribution, as it's understood over time, has been both underestimated and idealized. Some will argue that her prominence and her contribution to first and second generation Quakers has not been fully appreciated. So this is a little effort to try to rescue what might be a more accurate understanding of her role. One historian writes, "If one wishes to understand Fell, it is first necessary to reconcile some contradictory material. We've seen that Margaret Fell was capable of courage. She was also capable of peccancy, which I believe is giving offense, pettiness, and belligerence. She was given to generosity. She was likewise given to self-serving materialism. She was endowed with the skill of giving spiritual inspiration to beleaguered Quaker missionaries. She was also endowed with an ability to exhibit highly authoritarian behavior. As the matriarch of Swarthmore Hall, she demonstrated noblesse oblige to those who were loyal to Quakerism, especially showing benevolence to poor women of her meeting." So I think we would conclude she was, in other words, fully human. With this in mind, we might rethink the title that she gets so often as Mother of Quakerism and think of her more as the Mother Superior of Quakerism. So here's what we're going to do in the time we have, and I'm going to try to get through this. I want to start with a real brief bio sketch that'll just give you scaffolding of sort of important dates. And then talk about the historical context in which she lived and in which Quakerism was born. And then we'll look at early Quakerism before we come to Margaret's role and her influence and leadership. And then we have some queries for discussion based on what we've talked about. So here you have, I'm sure some of you will recognize, Swarthmore Hall. So Margaret was born in 1614, died in 1702 at age 88. She spends her whole life, except when traveling, in this northwestern corner of England, which was somewhat remote from the rest of the country. She comes from a pretty wealthy family, landed gentry. She gets a good education, and she lives a very secure life growing up. At age 18 in 1632, she marries Thomas Fell and moves to his home, Swarthmore Hall, which becomes her home for the rest of her life, the next 70 years. In 1652, and we'll come back to that date, she is convinced by George Fox of the Quaker beliefs. She's 38 years old at the time. She's the mother to 7 children at the time, 6 girls and 1 boy, and she has another daughter the following year in 1653. Now, there are big gaps in this, and we're going to fill some of this in, but in 1658, her husband Thomas dies. Well, I skipped over 1652. That was her convincement when George Fox visits Swarthmore. 1658, Thomas Fell dies, and we'll talk more about what ensues from that. 1660 was her first trip to London. She undertook 10 trips to London over a span of 37 years, the last one being in 1697 at the age of 83. This was a 200-mile ride on horseback that she did 10 times, and always in the service of Quakers, always to promote, to support, to confront, to advocate those in power in London. She's imprisoned for refusing to take an oath of allegiance in 1664 and remains there for 4 years, charged with treason for her unwillingness to take the oath. And she does some of her most influential writing during that period while she's in prison. She gets out of prison, and the next year she marries George Fox. She's 55 at that point. George is 45, so she's a cougar. They were married for 22 years, of which they lived together for 4 years. So much travel and moving and so on, but they were together whenever they could be together, but it wasn't often. So there's a lot of correspondence. In 1670, she was imprisoned again on the same charge, and due to some nefarious maneuvering by her son, who was trying to claim Swarthmore and all of the land around it. So she was there for another year, and during that time, a new, very severe wave of persecution swept the country. But from there onwards, she continued writing, traveling, supporting meetings throughout England. In 1676, William Penn comes to Swarthmore, and they strike up a fast friendship. She and George Fox and William Penn really collaborated a lot from that time on. And then she dies in 1702 at Swarthmore at age 88. So all of this occurs against the backdrop of tremendous turmoil and upheaval in 17th century England. And so you have there on the left Charles I, in the middle Oliver Cromwell, and on the right Charles II. And these were those who were in charge during the period of the first and second generation of Quakers. So as I say, it was this period of tremendous turmoil and unrest that starts really with the Reformation. So the 16th century sees the upheaval of the Protestant Reformation in Europe and in England. And it's a rejection of the teachings and practices of the Catholic Church and of the authority of the Pope. So you'll remember some of what went on in the Lutheran Reformation. It was rather distinctive in England, that Reformation and the turmoil that extended over a longer period of time, so it was a long Reformation, came about because of Henry VIII's wish to divorce or annul, have his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, and the Pope refusing to do so. And so Henry decided he would take his ball and go form his own church, the Church of England, with him at the head of it, and that occurred in 1531. So this is the birth of Protestantism, and the main plank which of Luther's theology, and Michael, I'm sure, can correct me on any and all of this, but which resonated with English Protestants as well, was that salvation comes through faith and grace, rather than through good works or church practices, or it just is available to us. And so you have established the Church of England, and these issues continue to evolve and be debated, and many different ideas arising from this, including struggles over the freedom of conscience, like the ability to worship as I wish, to have the beliefs and practice the faith that I wish, instead of the one that's dictated to me by the government. The right to assemble, to be able to meet for worship, and in general, religious liberty. These fights continued from the late 16th and into the mid-17th century. And as a result, you see a proliferation of what were called non-conforming and dissenting religious movements. And I think it demonstrates there was this really deep and widespread spiritual hunger that the church was not satisfying, that people were seeking for something that would be more meaningful and more deeply spiritual for themselves. And this included the Quakers. So there were, among those dissenting, there are objections to mandatory attendance, and the mandatory payment of tithes was not an option. And they had different ideas about forms of worship and ritual, about religious practices, and as I said, the freedom of conscience. And they really lean away from this emphasis on ritual and ceremony. They want something more authentic, more deeply spiritual. And during this time, some of them opted to leave the country. So, from where we sit, 1620, the Pilgrims established the Plymouth colony. They had been known as separatists and were one of these dissenting sects. And they decided to leave the country and find freedom in the colonies. 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is established by the Puritans. And then 1682, the establishment of Pennsylvania. So all of this religious ferment and the conflicts are closely related to the political turmoil and conflicts. And if you think about it, what's breaking open here is the idea that you have a monarch who is supreme, that some would say has divine authority, and you have one church. You have one king, you have one church. That's how things are supposed to be. And this is breaking open. So the king is being challenged by those who think he shouldn't have absolute power. And there's this ongoing struggle between the parliament and the king on the relative balance of power. Parliament has relatively little influence, but for taxation. The king is unable to, he neither has the authority nor the capacity to raise money without the parliament. And this becomes a very protracted struggle between them, especially because apparently Charles I was quite extravagant. So he needed the money. So this struggle between parliament and the monarchy grows deeper. Those who support the monarch are also aligned with the established church. And those who seek to curb the power of the monarchy align with the Puritans. And the political conflict comes to a boiling point in 1642 with the Civil War. And this ends with the capture and the eventual beheading of Charles I in 1649. So with the execution of the king, England becomes a commonwealth, and it's ruled by a rump parliament, that is a small section of what was a wider parliament, all aligned with the Puritans. So in 1653, Oliver Cromwell dissolves the parliament, and he becomes the Lord Protector within this commonwealth. Toward the end of his period, his rule also begins to disintegrate, and eventually this leads to the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Cromwell dies, his son takes over for him, doesn't have the popularity of his father, and it becomes weaker and weaker, and finally there's enough agreement that they want the king. They want a king again. So Charles II returns from exile and takes the throne. But during this period, so 1650-ish to 1660 or so, is called the interregnum. And it was this very particular period of time with Cromwell and the parliamentarians in charge. There was a greater degree of religious liberty, and this sort of idea of one church and religious uniformity that was imposed by the king begins to break down. Cromwell allows for greater dissent, and in general it was a period of great ferment and instability because the institutions were up for grabs and everybody had a lot of ideas, and it was just kind of roiling. Okay, and this is where we turn to early Quakerism, because that was the backdrop, and the 1650s is a critically important time for the beginning and development of Quakerism. So it began as one of these many sects that I've mentioned, and these sects were even more prolific in the northern part of the country. They had a lot of different and very interesting names. So you have the Ranters, the Seekers, the Diggers, the Muggletonians, the Grindletonians, the Fifth Monarchists, the Familists, the Separatists, the Descendants, the Levelers, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists. And not only did you have a lot of these that were mostly characterized by itinerant preachers moving around the countryside, speaking their truth, there's tremendous fluidity among them. So you have people who might identify themselves and participate in one sect for a period, and then something else draws their attention, so they move on, and just a tremendous kind of churning and fluidity. And the effect of this is a lot of ideas are interwoven and exchanged amongst all of these who are looking for a more authentic kind of faith. All of them, though, in broad strokes, if we were to look at what some of the key themes were that were being pursued through these different sects, there's a strong emphasis on a direct relationship with God, with no need for intermediaries. A lot of rejection of, so let's say, the pomp and circumstance of worship. An insistence on the liberty of conscience, that is, their right to believe what they believed and worship as they believe. And some of them really reject all external forms of religion, and there's a number of them that lean heavily toward mysticism. So in the midst of all of this, the Quakers begin to emerge, and the scholarship is that they drew primarily, so the Quakers themselves were drawing people away from other sects, from the Seekers, the Ranters, the Familists, and the Baptists. Were probably the streams that fed into what became Quakerism. So George Fox begins to preach in 1647, and by all accounts he was a very powerful preacher. And because of that, he begins to attract a small following who travel around with him as he moves. He's got a little entourage. And probably most of those came from the Seekers. Interestingly, as they met and he preached, the format for their worship, that is, waiting in silence together, the format of unprogrammed worship is already established by 1651. So our form of worship today is that was practiced almost 400 years ago. By 1652, Fox is attracting crowds of up to 1,000 people, which, considering the population, it was quite significant. And he's not seeking to form a sect. He's just about preaching. sharing his truth. So it was a very loose movement of those who were subscribing to what he was preaching. So he moved about preaching, convincing people. There was a lot of emphasis on who had been convinced, and then just leaving little groups of these followers to themselves and heading out to the next place. And all of this doesn't really begin to coalesce for about 5 years, which brings us to 1652. And why 1652? That was when George Fox arrives at Swarthmore Hall. And the events of 1652 mark a profound moment in the Quaker movement, without which it is very unlikely we would be here today. So let's see what happens in 1652 and thereafter. So we come to Swarthmore Hall, the home of Justice Fell and his wife Margaret. They are very well known for their hospitality. They often host these itinerant preachers who are roaming the countryside. And it's clear that this would lead to a very kind of a salon, like a place of a lot of discussion, debate over both religious and political issues. Judge Fell is a Puritan and a Cromwell supporter. The information we have suggests that Margaret herself was a longtime seeker, that she had this desire for a more authentic faith. She was looking for beliefs and practices that would speak to her inner yearning, something that would provide her with greater guidance in her daily life and her interactions. In her own words, she said, "I was inquiring after the way of the Lord, and went often to hear the best ministers that came into our parts. Many of those which were accounted the most serious and godly men, some of which were then called lecturing ministers, and had often prayers and religious exercises in our family. This I hoped I did well in, but often I feared that I was short of the right way." So there was a lot of questioning to go along with her seeking, a lot of concern that she was falling short in the way she lived her life, and like just more and more determined in her seeking. Okay, so Fox arrives at Swarthmore in June. This is the first time the family hears of Quakers. There's a lot of preachers coming and going, but this is the first time that they hear of the Quakers. Margaret describes her experience. "He opened us a book that we had never read in, nor indeed had never heard that it was our duty to read in it. The light of Christ in our consciences, our minds never being turned toward it before." So this is what was new to her, the idea that there was this inward source that should be the focus of our faith and practice. So the definitive message, which was given at a Puritan worship service in nearby Ulverston by Fox, really dwelt on this idea of the indwelling of the light of Christ and the inwardness of true religion, along with rebuking those who seem to practice religion without this illuminating spirit of Christ. And this message is really a life-altering revelation for Margaret. She said, "This opened me so that it cut me to the heart. And then I saw clearly that we were all wrong. So I sat down in my pew again and cried bitterly. And I cried in my spirit to the Lord, we are all thieves. We have taken the scripture and words and know nothing of them in ourselves." So I think this idea that we're just passive consumers of what's being dished out to us by these clergy, and it doesn't speak to this spiritual seeking and hunger that I have. So a snapshot of the movement at that time, as I said before, the 1650s are crucial for the Quaker meeting in this interregnum period where there's a little bit of more space for this sort of discussion and exploration. The way the early Quakers thought about it is that the church was in apostasy, that had just fallen away from the original truth that was revealed in Christ, with Christ's message. And that in place of that, they're substituting rituals, they're preaching sermons that are based on their own opinions and not on Scripture, and just in every way felt that there was the need was to return to the primitive early Christian church, to recapture those beliefs and those practices, and reject everything else that was available then. As part of that, they also really focused a lot on suffering, which they also identified with the early church and with Christ himself. That the suffering was sort of an indicator of the depth of their faith, but also the fulfillment of their covenant with God. So, and in no time at all, they're going to have plenty of opportunity for suffering. But they kind of upheld that as part of their faith. Okay. So they're, at this period, really spreading the word far and wide. And at this time was the launch of what I'm sure some of you have heard of, the Valiant 60, which was more than 60 people. They were also known as the Publishers of Truth. But it was a troupe of mostly ordinary farmers and tradespeople from northern England. Several of them were women. And they just fan out across the countryside and out of the countryside heading south to preach the word. And right away, many of them land in prison, both the preachers and those that they're preaching to. So there's a lot of reasons why they land in prison. Maybe they refuse to attend church services of the Church of England, or refuse to pay their tithes, or refuse to swear oaths, or take up arms. They also might have been in prison because of actions that they took in resistance, like disrupting church services, like public nudity, and like what people considered as blasphemy. But with this, the movement is launched, sort of far and wide, and it begins to coalesce within a relatively short period of time into a religion. And interestingly, those who are suffering imprisonment, little by little, tend to gain more prominence within the movement, and this sort of inner circle also begins to emerge about that time. But in general, our snapshot would say that it was a movement that was scattered, nascent, and suffering. And into this picture steps Margaret Fell. So following her convincement in 1652, Margaret Fell utterly devotes herself to the Quaker movement, which, as we said, is a quite loose and scattered association. And what she brings to this is her social status as a landed gentry, sort of mid-level landed gentry, and all the connections that go with that, and all of those that are associated with her husband, who was such a prominent individual. Her wealth, her courage, and her ability to communicate and inspire, her deep knowledge of the scriptures, and her organizational ability, and all of this she poured into the Quaker movement and then church for the rest of her life, for the following 50 years. So Swarthmore Hall becomes the headquarters of the movement. And more than a headquarters, it's really kind of the nerve center of the movement. It serves as a safe way station and meeting place for traveling ministers and emerging leaders. And in part here, because of Thomas Fell's standing, his status in the community provides a little bit of a protective shield for what goes on within the hall. He himself, I should mention, he himself was also something of a seeker, but So he was always interested to hear what these itinerant preachers had to say when they came and stayed with them. But he seems relatively satisfied with Puritanism, and that's kind of where he plants himself, but always open. Okay, but Margaret, as the mistress of Swarthmore, really had necessarily hones her capacity as a manager and as a steward. And she enjoys a fair degree of autonomy in this role because Justice Fell is away for extended periods of time, and she's left to run the house and the household and the farm. And this autonomy becomes even greater when Judge Fell dies in 1658, because of her status as widow. She has even greater latitude for decision-making, for life choices, and for control of the wealth that's been left to her. So she was, the fact of her widowhood and her autonomy itself seems like a very important factor in what and how she was able to contribute to the building up of Quakerism. So in this occasion when she's convinced, she's taken not just with the ideas that Fox preaches, but by the man himself. And they immediately begin an ongoing correspondence over time, and it marks the start of a spiritual friendship, collaboration, and partnership that was to last for the rest of their lives. And it leads in 1669 to their marriage. Okay, again, here we are with this loose, far-flung network. And Margaret's call is not to be a preacher, not to travel, at least not now, but to exercise her gift for hospitality. And with that, she nurtures in person this kind of loving community. Most of her household servants are also convinced. I believe all of her daughters were convinced. Her son was not, and there was a lot of animosity and conflict with him. But just beginning to weave together this community to become a more cohesive and defined community. But in addition to being a physical hub, Swarthmore, under Margaret's direction, becomes a clearinghouse, a publishing house, and an archive for correspondence. And as I said, with all of that being kind of the nerve center of the movement. And I must say, it called to mind for me, us on Zoom during the pandemic. So we couldn't be together. And imagine if we hadn't had Zoom. How would we have maintained our community? How would we communicated with one another? And we had this fantastic tool that we were able to use to keep us knit together. Well, the tool that was available in 1650s was correspondence. So lots and lots of letters, vast correspondence. And interestingly, kind of as a side note, these letters have become one of the most reliable sources for reconstructing the history of Quakerism. Because when we looked at some other things like histories that have been written or George Fox's journals, those were not written contemporaneously. They were written retrospectively, and they were, in most cases, written with a certain bent, a certain focus, and often gave Fox a very flattering kind of portrayal, and others less so. And also, well, so these letters paint a picture of the practices and the travel and the interaction with local authorities. It just paints a very vivid picture of what was going on in these areas where Quakers were beginning to emerge. And I was interested to learn that there's evidence that they were written with a certain consciousness that they might become the Quaker, might become the historic record. And it made me think of our minutes, which were famous for our minute taking. So it seems there's always been this sort of meta thing with the Quakers where we want to be able to tell our story. So, and these letters are a tremendous source for that. So with all this instability of the early years, There were no formal meeting houses. These itinerant preachers are always on the move. It's a challenge to maintain this correspondence. But they were seen as a way to develop, and they served through the exchange, because it was back and forth. They were a vehicle for debate and discussion about beliefs and doctrine, and a lot of this got developed through this correspondence. And importantly, as we said, they created a sense of community. One historian has said, the cornerstone of this emergent religion was the communication network that held itinerants together. And so again, without this, we might be doing something else on Sunday afternoon, but we wouldn't be sitting at FCS together. So this network is uniting people throughout England, in continental Europe, and in the colonies. So the correspondence went in every direction. So these itinerant preachers are among the most important correspondents, and they write to Margaret to give her the news, to tell her what's going on, what's happening with their work, what are the challenges, what are the joys and concerns, we could say. And they all come to Swarthmore Hall, and they're written either to Margaret, or sometimes they're written to a third party in care of Margaret. So she's meant to read them, but then get them to their intended recipient. But at the same time, copies of the letters are made, and sometimes forwarded to the wider community, and other copies are retained in an archive. So there is this existing archive of correspondence. So what was in the letters? Well, first and foremost, or first anyway, so almost unfailingly opens with tremendous expressions of admiration, affection, and appreciation for Margaret and for her work on behalf of Quakers, and for her inspiration. And that was followed by news, especially news about suffering, if anyone was in prison, if they'd be beat up or chased out of places and so on. This became an important focus of the correspondent. And then, as I said, there would follow some debate on key issues within the movement and about current events. And then often they ended with a request to pass their regards to this person or that person. So again, evidence of this serving to help weave the community together. There were also letters, numerous letters, from George Fox, from Margaret Fell, and from others to the king or to Cromwell, the Lord Protector. They regularly wrote to high officials with the idea of trying to influence their thinking and to advocate on behalf of those who were suffering and advocate on behalf of greater religious liberty. And over time, these became more and more kind of like newsletters as opposed to individual letters of correspondence. So besides informing everyone about what was going on in the larger movement, it was also a way for Quakers in far-flung areas, in remote areas, to feel like they were participating in and were actually part of the development of Quakerism. So again, like not just consumers, but were actively engaged and involved in what was unfolding. And the mechanics of these network were quite challenging. Again, because you have people itinerating all over the place. They're not in one place for very long. But also that to some extent it had to be a clandestine network, because those in charge saw it as potentially subversive. So there were big attempts to try to intercept whenever possible the correspondence. And this meant sometimes in the letters there would be elaborate instructions about how to send them to be sure that they could reach their intended recipient. So instructions came, for example, with one letter, they were trying to reach somebody who was in Barbados. And it said, the letter should be sent by way of London and Bristol, and from there sent to Lieutenant Colonel Rusin at the back side of his house in Barbados. And that way they thought they could be pretty confident that the letter would be received. So Margaret's role in all of this is, again, her status that makes them very well connected, and gave access to people, especially when sort of pleading their case. And just the centrality and stability that she was always there. That's who people could reach out to and feel like they would connect and that they would get a response. Her role also was, she was the curator of the correspondence. So she was the one who decided which letter should go where and who should receive this letter and that letter. And it gave her a great deal of editorial control. And through this also, she was tracking the movements of these itinerants and getting news about what was going on. And that fed into their ability to make some strategic choices about where should people go, like where is there a need, where is there an opportunity, and they could begin to direct this itineracy more than they would without this correspondence. So what more do the letters tell us? They do provide a record of the emergence of key figures, especially, as we said, those who exemplified the suffering life of a Quaker. This was during the time when there was no one leader. The leadership was shared among many individuals, and that it was only as other potential leaders began to fall away for one reason or another that George Fox began to emerge and assume the mantle of founder of the faith. So it seems it's kind of a debatable point, or we might not understand it. It might not be as clear-cut as we've been made to understand over time with him as the leader of the faith. But the historians say even more so because Margaret, in this curation, was able very actively to promote his image and his ideas and his authority and to suppress others who might have different points of view. Nothing's new. Yeah. Okay, so that very quickly describes her critically important work in constructing and managing this network of correspondence. But she was also a very strong and courageous advocate. And now I want to talk just about this one important experience. Next slide. So when the monarchy was restored in 1660, there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concern about whether the new king would allow for religious liberty, or would this lead to an intensification of persecution. So to set the scene, the persecution of Quakers had intensified at the end of the interregnum when Oliver Cromwell dies and his son takes over. His son, feeling threatened because he was weak, intensified his persecution. Also, the army was owed back pay, so they weren't interested in helping him out at all. So he was very weak at that time, and part of his response to his weakness, does this sound familiar? Part of his response to his weakness was to persecute people that he thought were challenging him. So there's persecution coming from the top. But there's also, in this period of instability, persecution coming more at the local level, from clergy and constables who aren't happy with these sects and all the turmoil and trouble that they're creating. So Richard goes into exile in 1659. Charles returns to England and takes the throne in 1660. And just about that very time, George Fox is arrested by local constables at Swarthmore Hall, and he's charged with plotting against the king. And he's arrested and imprisoned in Lancaster Castle. This galvanizes Margaret to act. And it does mark kind of a very intense period of her advocacy work on behalf of the Quakers. So as I said, she travels to London with her daughter Sarah to speak with the king, and to educate and inform officials about the Quakers. She makes this 200-mile trip on horseback, and she writes the statement that sets out basic information to explain who the people called Quakers, which at this time numbered about 20,000, who these 20,000 people are and what they believe. So, and her paper, I have to come around to read it. I love these titles. It's like an abstract in the title. A declaration and information from the people of God called Quakers to the present something, sorry. I have it, so let me, can you, governors? Yeah, sorry. To the present governors, the king, and both houses of parliament, and all whom it may concern. That's who the statement was to. Well, due to Margaret's connections, her gentrified status, she succeeds in meeting with the king and other high officials while she is in London. And it's only weeks after Charles II is crowned that Margaret puts into his hand herself this statement. It's a very forceful and strategic statement. Those of us who've worked in public policy could probably really admire her messaging. Like, she got the messaging right. And the intent first was to explain Quaker beliefs and principles to the new government. But one historian goes on to say that another driver for this was to fulfill the Quaker responsibility to be clear and truthful with all men and women so that ignorance, misunderstanding, and misinformation might not foster bloodshed and persecution. Fell emphasizes that a Quaker failure to declare and inform would be wrong and make the movement responsible for the violence done to it. So that's something to chew on for a while, I think. That's the first I had heard of that idea. So in the letter, she describes in detail the persecution that the Quakers had suffered, things like having holes bored through their tongues and a lot of imprisonment. And in it, she compares this to the kind of persecution suffered by the apostles and the early Christian church. But here's where the messaging comes, because she focuses especially on the beliefs that were manifested in behavior that people were seen as, or the behavior that was most misunderstood and was thought to be offensive or threatening or heretical. So first is their refusal to support the state church with mandatory tithes. And what she says, she explains that the Anglican Church has nothing to offer them. It doesn't serve them in any way, and they don't want to participate, and they don't want to pay for what they're not going to, why should they pay when it serves them in no way? Beyond which she goes on to cite scriptural references against tithes. And says really simply that they believe the Anglican Church is corrupt and not true to Christ's teachings. The second was their refusal to swear oaths, and why, including oaths of allegiance to the king. She says, for obedience to him and his commands, that is God, for obedience to him and his commands, who said, do not swear at all, do we suffer. Allegiance only to God. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. This is why we don't say oaths, so now you know. The third is their refusal to show special signs of respect to people in higher class or station. So people are very bent out of shape when they wouldn't take their hats off, or when they use the informal form of address. And she says, we suffer because we cannot respect persons, which is contrary to the apostles' doctrine and practice, who has said, truly I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him, so they are to show no partiality. Everybody's equal. And, and we're going to act as if that were true. And then finally, and what we might know this most importantly or most familiarly, was her declaration that the Quakers are a peaceful people. Next slide. She says in her declaration, "We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same. We do deny and bear our testimony against all strife, wars, and contentions that come from the lusts that war in the members, that war against the soul, which we wait for and watch for in all people. We love and desire the good of all. For no other cause but love to the souls of all people have our sufferings been." The declaration was signed by 13 leading Quaker men, all men, including George Fox. And it is the very first written document to proclaim Quakers' firm belief in peace and their their denial of the use of warlike weapons for any purpose. Well, she achieved, so as I say, she was able to put this into King Charles's hand. And there were other interactions in time, correspondence and meetings. She, the record shows she had numerous meetings with the king, as did Fox. Her initials, she succeeded in getting Fox's release in September, but there followed pretty quickly after that, as Charles's rule began to unfold, a very severe wave of persecution that lasted for another 10 years or more. So time does not permit much more than that, especially this period that came between then and the end of her life. But there were a couple other things just to touch on briefly, if we can have the next slide. She was a very outspoken advocate on behalf of women's active engagement in Quakerism, looking both at their role in worship and in governance. So this idea of spiritual equality between men and women was a tenet of Quakerism from the very start, and including one of the early preachers in 1647 when Fox began to preach and gathered up some followers was a woman, Elizabeth Houghton. So Margaret writes, while she's in prison in Lancaster, she writes a pamphlet called Women Speaking Justified. And what's interesting here is she's not proactively making the case, because she said, women are speaking in our meetings. I'm not arguing with you about whether they should or not. I'm telling you why it's right for them to be doing this. That's the nature of what she writes. And it shows tremendous biblical scholarship. She does a lot of sort of recontextualizing and reinterpreting some of the scriptures, especially from Paul. And she highlights the role of women throughout the Bible. But it's also worth noting that all of this is within spiritual equality, like what happens in the meetings, in the worship, because the prevailing gender norms outside of worship continue and are not addressed so much. Yeah. So this could, there's so much about this, we can have many, many more meetings, but moving on, is the question of women's participation in governance of Quakerism, and in particular, the establishment of women's meetings. So in 1666, there was a feeling that the impact of the ongoing persecution was really undermining the organization, and it needed to be shored up, like more corporate organization. So Margaret and George thought about this, and they moved together to set up the corporate structure that continues to our time. They set up monthly, quarterly, and yearly meetings, each with their assigned charges and roles to perform. It wasn't until, and men's business meetings were part of that. And it wasn't until 5 years later, 1671, that they established women's meetings. And the charge for these women meetings, by my estimation, if we were doing this today, it would be a combination of pastoral care, the aid fund, religious education, and clearness committees, all wrote into one, and that was the work of the women's meetings. They were caring for the ill, for people in precarious situations or in financial distress. They were overseeing the youth growing into adulthood. They were involved in the care of marriages, and for supporting people who refused to pay tithes. And this work was really very integral in maintaining the social order and the spiritual cohesion within Quakerism. Again, another factor that allows it to survive and eventually flourish. But it runs into a lot of opposition. It doesn't enjoy immediate widespread support. And one of the things that people find most objectionable was under the care of meeting, it was in effect 2 readings. So the first one, the couple has to come before the women's meeting and get talked to, and as we do. And then the women's meeting would go away and assess and investigate and so on and pass their findings to the men's meeting, and then the couple had to go meet with the men's meeting. And people really objected to women having the first take at this. So it was a very heated exchange, and apparently Margaret got a lot of, as they said, Margaret was run upon for being quite outspoken on the issue. And in fact, some of those who disagreed with this separated and took themselves out of the Quakerism. But they persisted. Margaret and her daughters, with a lot of support from Fox, persisted, and they established these meetings, and they continued in spite of this opposition. And this was true also in the colonies. There were women's meetings in the colonies. But there are areas of England where they don't exist, where the opposition was greatest. So, when we think about her role with respect to women's equality, I think the testimony of her life is probably the most compelling argument for women's equality, spiritual or otherwise. And we're going to end with just a footnote. Well, I won't say a footnote, but this came up when we were talking last week, so I just wanted to add this very, in my mind, little-known issue, which was Margaret's affinity for the Jews and her engagement with the Jews. So this is evident in 1656 when Cromwell is in office. He decides to readmit Jews to England. They're having been expelled in 1290 and not allowed in the country since then. And it really seems like somehow this really interested and even preoccupied Margaret, because she wrote 5 books addressed to the Jews. And they were all fundamentally an appeal to Jews to convert to Quakerism. On one level. On another level, it was an appeal for them to turn to the inward light, even if they were still Jews. That to move away from outward expressions of religion and really turn toward that inner light. And here was one of her quotes. No, we're going to skip that. So she did, as we said, she wrote these books or pamphlets. They circulated pretty widely, particularly in the Netherlands, which had this large concentration of Jews, many of whom had left Portugal. And so they were translated into Dutch, but they also wanted to get a wider circulation amongst the Jewish community, so they were advised it should be translated from Dutch into Hebrew. And they were looking for who could do this, and they were having a really hard time finding the translator until this one fellow appeared who had been excommunicated from his synagogue. He was very interested in what the Quakers were talking about, and he came to some meetings and so on. And the Quakers that were there wrote to Margaret to say, well, this guy says he's willing to do the translation. And it seems, as historians looked into this, that individual was Spinoza. So Spinoza was Margaret Feld's translator. So that's just a little interesting footnote, because I don't think it went anywhere, really. Yes, I like this quote of hers. Friends, let the eternal light search you and try you. It will rip you up, lay you open, provoke one another to love. And I think if we look, I mean, to wind this up, just to say, having heard those names of just some of the sects that were roaming the English countryside in the mid-17th century, relatively few survive to this day. You could say the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Puritans became the Unitarians, so they're still around, the Congregationalists, and the Quakers. And it seems really very clear when you look over Margaret Fell's life that one of the reasons that, as I said, that we're here today, that Quakerism survived, is because of her ability to knit this community together, to be part of the development of the beliefs and practices of the religion. And I must say, having been so immersed in this, sitting in meeting today, it's amazing to sit there and really feel connected to these people 400 years ago. It's the same spirit. It's the same light. And it's the same, it's the same joy that she experienced. So we have 2 queries to share. The first query: Margaret came to Quakerism out of a deep spiritual hunger that was not satisfied by the established church, Puritanism, or other sects that proliferated during the mid-17th century. That spiritual hunger began to be satisfied when she heard George Fox ask this: "You will say that Christ saith this, and the apostles saith this, but what canst thou say? Art thou a child of light, and hast walked in the light, and what thou speakest, is it inwardly from God?" So the query is, what drew you to Quakerism? How do you answer the question, what canst thou say? And our second query, and as usual, I think you just discuss whichever query speaks to you, okay? Second one: Margaret's declaration from us, the people called Quakers, was written during troubled times of turmoil and persecution. She wanted to make clear the testimony and beliefs of Quakers and to speak truth to power. What is our declaration as the people called Quakers in our day to those in power in our own troubled times? So if we were going to write a declaration together, what would it be? What would we put in it?